Hey guys, it's Chandler, and welcome to the Healing Heroes.
I promise you.
I'm Chandler Stroud, an executive, wife, and busy mom of two, who after years of living with anxiety, health struggles, and an unshakable feeling like I should be happier, made a profound discovery that changed everything. Join me on a journey where unexpected paths lead to healing and more happiness. On this show, we'll explore unconventional ways to unlock more joy in your own life with the help of my very own healers and trusted advisors, the Healing Heroes. Hey everyone, thanks for joining today. I am really excited for what promises to be a deeply meaningful conversation with my friend Jen Baumgold, who also happens to be my therapist and the person I entrusted to guide me through EMDR therapy, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And basically, EMDR is an approach that's used to help people process past traumatic events or circumstances in a way that's easier to do in the here and now. So I'm going to let Jen tell you a lot more about that during our conversation today. But before we get there, I want to go back and offer a little bit of personal context, as I so often do at the beginning of these episodes. First off, I highly recommend you go back and listen to the first episode of the Healing Heroes podcast, where I tell you a little bit more about what you can expect from this show and how what I learned can help guide you toward living a more fulfilling life. And as part of that conversation, I recount my own experience with childhood trauma and abuse. And so I think that's really helpful context as you guys listen to all of these Healing Heroes episodes, but specifically today's, of course, because EMDR was such an important part of my own journey. But for today's episode specifically, it's important to note that it was Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, that served as a catalyst for me reaching out to Jen in the first place. And ultimately, learning that the relief and happiness that I was so desperately looking for could only be found in the work I was avoiding. I'd like to take a moment to read a passage I wrote in my journal after my first EMDR session with Jen to really bring this process to life for listeners before we dive into our conversation today. It's been a very long time since I wrote in a diary, very long time, but I'm feeling compelled to write after last night's session with my therapist, Jen Baumgold. It was my first EMDR session, and it was much harder than I anticipated. Not because I had to relive and retell some of the most disturbing moments of the abuse I endured, though that wasn't easy or fun either. But what really struck me and caused deep pain were the feelings that resulted from the abuse that I still carry with me today. Feelings about myself and my worth that were under the surface and very much intertwined with the events of my youth. If you had asked me 6 months ago, I would have told you I had minimal lingering effects and that by most standards, I was a highly successful, thriving, ambitious woman with a promising future who had fully processed the disturbing events of my childhood. I thought I outran it and that it wasn't holding me back in any way. And maybe it wasn't, but the emotional toll this has had on me in the last 24 hours would suggest otherwise. I just don't get it. How could I go 30 years without realizing these deep-rooted beliefs about myself that were born from a collection of traumatic experiences in my youth? So guys, there's obviously a lot to unearth here, and we'll get into it today with Jen. But first, let me tell you a little bit more about my friend Jen Baumgold before we begin. She's a licensed clinical social worker and is a psychotherapist specializing in the treatment of trauma. Jen is certified in EMDR and works with clients to help untangle the knots of trauma while finding a path toward healing and resilience. After graduating with her master's in social work, Jennifer began her career at the New York City Fire Department Counseling Service Unit, where she worked until 2016. During her time there, she provided crucial mental health support to FDNY members and their families. In addition to her private practice, Jen is an active member of the Fairfield County Trauma Response Team, a volunteer alliance of mental health professionals committed to aiding first responders and the local community in healing from trauma, tragedy, and stress. Please join me in welcoming Jen to the show today. So great to have you here. Thank you for being with us.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me, Chandler. I'm very excited to talk about this, and so powerful for you to share that journal entry. And, we don't often, as therapists, get to hear that, the processing that happens after the session. So I'm grateful for that as well.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for guiding me through countless sessions in your office that have really unlocked so much self-knowing, happiness, and just more self-worth in general. So I really appreciate that. And that's what we're going to get into today. First, I'd love to cover off on the basics of what psychotherapy is. Can you share a little bit more about what you do?
I think we kind of have this idea, or everyone has this idea of what therapy is, and it's different for each person, what's represented in the media and pop culture, and what our own experience is. And the truth is, it is something different to everyone. So I think in trying to find a definition of what therapy is to me, when I was in graduate school, my clinical supervisor gave me the book, The Gift of Therapy by Irving Yalom. And he describes therapy and the role of the therapist as removing obstacles from the path to self-actualization. We're constantly helping clients to remove obstacles. We're not actually doing the heavy lifting, you guys are, but we're helping to identify and remove those obstacles. So in this case, the obstacle could be trauma, but it could also be something like a behavior that's preventing you from getting the things that you want in life. A negative belief about yourself or cognition that's you struggled with your entire life that, prevents you again from getting where you want to be in life. There's any number of obstacles. It can be clinical symptoms when it's depression or anxiety. It can be relationships or patterns in relationships. So I thought that definition kind of encompassed it all, that the therapist helps the client to remove these obstacles and also to shine a light on things in a way that help us get to where we want to be.
One of the reasons I reached out to you initially was because you specialized in trauma and EMDR therapy, which, as we mentioned, stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy. Can you explain what EMDR is to listeners and the various reasons someone might reach out to you for this sort of treatment?
Sometimes when something happens to us and it's traumatic, it sticks out in our memory differently than everything else. The sights, the sounds, the smells, the sensory experiences that go with it tend to get stuck and then come up in places where we're reminded of it. And EMDR helps us to access that in a different way and to process it in a different way that takes away all that avoidance, all the defenses, that subconscious governing system that's like, oh, we can't talk about this. We have to just have the response that's expected of us. And EMDR allows that to kind of fall away and talk about something that's traumatic in a way that isn't overwhelming to your nervous system and isn't threatening. I think we have this innate capacity as humans to have an adaptive healing process in our minds, the same way we do in our bodies. If you get a cut, it heals. It's the same way with so many things that happen that are upsetting in our lives. And you could think of things. You might have a fight with your husband. Even before you make up with him, it's resolved for you. You're not hanging on to it, or a fight with a friend or something. And even if that friendship dissolves, you can make peace with it. It comes to this like adaptive resolution. And traumatic experiences, for whatever reason, don't complete that cycle. EMDR helps us to complete that cycle. It helps us to come to this, okay, that's over. It happened, but it's not happening any longer, which is different than pre-EMDR, where when somebody's triggered, they feel like that trauma is happening all over again and it's manifesting in their body, or in their beliefs about themselves, or both. So EMDR is incredibly helpful in accessing it and reprocessing it to this point where it does come to that adaptive resolution and it is stored in the right place. And it doesn't come up unexpectedly, or it isn't triggered. You aren't reliving it. It happened and it's over. Often we blame ourselves for trauma, I think that's our brain's way of making sense of it. It's, you know, we can control it if we can figure out a reason why this happened. So it must be my fault. And in some ways that's adaptive, but when it gets linked to the trauma, it's not. And then we carry around these beliefs. So EMDR helps to reprocess that and come to a more adaptive belief about ourselves.
I'm curious, how does EMDR work in practice?
For when EMDR was originally created, the person who covered it was named Francine Shapiro, and she had received some distressing news about a cancer diagnosis. And she was taking a walk in the park, and she found herself, like, her eyes moving back and forth very quickly. And in that, it felt less distressing. And from there, she saw that this rapid eye movement allowed her to calm her nervous system and think about the trauma differently. So EMDR started off with eye movements, and the therapist would do something like this, or they'd have a light board. Now we found that you can use any kind of bilateral stimulation, which means stimulating the right side of the body, left side of the body, alternating back and forth while the person is talking about the trauma, essentially. And I think what that does is we're so defended against trauma, because if you think about it, trauma lives in your nervous system. What does your nervous system do? Your nervous system is in the service of survival. So that means it's there to keep you safe. So it's going to produce the fight or flight response or the freeze response, which has kept us alive, you know, all of our lives. Like, we need that, but it's a primitive part of our brain. The more advanced part of our brain, where we keep logic and reasoning and, you know, more abstract thought, that's not part of our nervous system. So when we go through a trauma, we don't have access to that part. And when that trauma gets triggered, we also don't have access to that part. So our bodies and minds, in the effort of keeping us safe, avoid things. Like, a common defense to avoid trauma, you know, a lot of times we can't actually access it. That avoidance mostly happens on a very subconscious level. So I think EMDR, through the bilateral stimulation, sort of, I wouldn't say removes the avoidance, but it allows it to kind of peel away in a way to get to be able to talk about the trauma in a safe way. So it's almost like it makes it less distressing to really look at and talk about. But beyond that, they're not really sure exactly how it works. We think it's similar to, you know, REM sleep, where you might, like, be going over something over and over again in your conscious cognitive mind, but then you dream about it and it seems to work itself out that way, or you go to sleep and it feels different in the morning. You have a different relationship to it. You think about it differently. So when you stimulate the body back and forth, left and right, it then also can produce, like, sort of a relaxed state where you might be able to access things differently.
It removes your own resistance to it subconsciously.
Right, and your own avoidance. Exactly. And you know from your experiences too, you know, it allows you to look at it in a less, it's not that it's not distressing, because it is, but you're able to move through that distressing. It doesn't get stuck. It moves it through your body. Whereas, like, if you don't have the EMDR, if you don't have the bilateral stimulation, it feels very difficult to talk about.
To your earlier point, it's always difficult to talk about, but there is something about the bilateral stimulation that kind of pushes you forward. Mm-hmm. It's sort of like, I honestly would liken it to going on a walk with a friend. Mm-hmm. And you hear the sound of the feet on the pavement. And if you stop to tie your shoe, or, you know, stop to smell the flowers, and your friend keeps walking, you want to keep up. Mm-hmm. Like, it sort of like urges you forward in a weird way. Everything, it's like a floodgate opens and things just pour out of you that you didn't know were there.
I love that, because I remember when I trained in EMDR, they talked about that, like, analogy of a train going through a tunnel. Like, you're not going to stop in the middle of the tunnel, right? Like, you have to keep going through that trauma. And I think in everyday life, and when you're just talking about it, that feels too threatening. But there's something about the EMDR process that keeps allowing you to go through it, you know, to move it. And as I said earlier, you know, trauma does get stuck. It doesn't process the same way. So EMDR helps to move that trauma to a more adaptive state. And I read somewhere that it makes the trauma a memory and not this sensory full body experience that, you know, it is when it starts.
That's a good way to describe it. How do you create the bilateral stimulation in these EMDR sessions with patients?
So some people stick to the eye movements, and other people have light boards. I personally use and I can get them and show them if you want me to, what we call colloquially tappers.
Why not? Yeah, show them.
So I use called TAC Audio Scan, and Neurotech, you're welcome for the free plug. Neurotech is the company that makes them. And they have these little...
So really quickly, for those who are watching on YouTube, Jen is holding up her EMDR tappers, my good friends, left and right.
Yes, left and right. The client would hold them in their hands and they alternate buzzing, very, very gentle buzzing. It's not like a shocking or anything, left and right. And that is what we would call bilateral stimulation. Another way that people can do it is also tapping on themselves or having the therapist tap on them if they're comfortable with that, like either on their legs, or we call the butterfly hug. You can go like this.
Yeah, so Jen is tapping her shoulders and demonstrating the butterfly tap. Again, if you want to check this out, you can watch this episode on YouTube.
And I think the client being able to tap on themselves, it was very helpful for virtual sessions. There's also a few apps I think that therapists use where the client can watch something on the screen and move their eyes back and forth. But the point is that you want that left-right alternating. And I think, you mentioned walking with a friend before, and, I'm a runner. So if I have something going on, I'll go for a run, and that's left-right movement of your legs, right? Same thing with walking. Any of that bilateral stimulation we do all the time without even realizing it. So it's a natural thing. Just we're kind of recreating it in this therapy session.
So when I reached out to you, I recognized that I did have a history of trauma and that maybe that was impacting me in the present. Do you think it's possible for people living day to day, their normal lives, to be unaware that they experienced a trauma and have that be wreaking havoc on them emotionally, physically, or in other ways?
Absolutely. And I think trauma is something different to every person. Like what might be traumatic to me may not be traumatic to you. It depends on so many different variables, like the person's family history, their genetics, their previous history of trauma. I think one of the indicators of trauma, or something that can be helped with EMDR, is when you have an outsized reaction to something in the present moment and you don't really understand why. Like, so if somebody's boss says something to them and it makes them feel, it activates that trauma because it reminds them of a parent that was critical, or a teacher who really shamed them. And, these things haven't been processed. That comes up in the moment. And you don't read it as trauma. You read it as, Mr. So-and-so, or I don't like my boss. They're picking on me all the time. It's unfair. Or it activates that negative belief. I'm not a good employee. I'm not a good worker. I'm bad. When that's not actually what's going on. So I think a lot of times when people are having reactions to trauma triggers and they're not even necessarily aware that that's what it is, it feels like a quote unquote overreaction, or being too sensitive, or, a lot of internalized shame around something that seemingly could be neutral.
I've really enjoyed reading and listening to Dr. Russell Kennedy of Anxiety RX, the book and podcast. And he talks about trauma showing up as an alarm in your body when you don't expect it necessarily in just, normal obligatory circumstances. And alarm is actually an acronym he uses for the different ways we can feel trauma: abandonment, loss, abuse, rejection, maturing too early, and shame. It's easier for me to think about, trauma really can result from anything that matures you too early in life. And I also found it helpful to think about it as it's not what happens to you, it's how you interpret what happens to you. Getting back to what you were saying about how everyone experiences and interprets events differently.
Absolutely. And I love that acronym. I think talk about the nervous system, and our nervous system is designed for one thing and one thing only, and that's for survival. And it is your body's alarm system, and it gets triggered when you are traumatized. And then when something, triggers that trauma, even though it's not happening now, that alarm system is going to go off and you don't know why. And sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't, but a lot of times it's a sensory memory, right? It's a smell, it's a sensation, a feeling. For somebody who was controlled, it can be when somebody's telling them what to do, and they're reacting to that person, or they perceive it as that person's telling them what to do. And that brings them back to a controlling parent or controlling abuser. So there's so many things that can set that alarm off that we're not aware of.
I'm curious how you've seen EMDR specifically help your patients. Why is it so effective?
I've seen it help in a number of different ways, and every time I'm really truly amazed by it. Sometimes it's in very big ways. I had a client who was in a car accident and couldn't drive. Trauma tends to pair things. So she began to pair driving with the accident and with danger. So it became too dangerous to drive, which she then successfully was able to drive after EMDR sessions. I've had people who have specific phobias, and that's another thing that EMDR can help with, because oftentimes, again, those things are fused together. I had a client who never ate fruit and was in their 60s and didn't really view it as an issue. We had done EMDR around some other things, but it came up, and so we did the EMDR on that, and they were then able to eat fruit. And it turned out that the fruit, when we trace that back to childhood, was the way that they were able to gain control over their narcissistic mother by not eating the fruit. And then that became sort of wired together for their life until they were able to untangle that. And so, it helps with specific phobias. It helps with single incident traumas. It helps in ways that are a little more subtle too. I think it can build capacity in people and create space and room for emotions that had been there but hadn't been able to really feel them before because the trauma was taking up so much space. So by being able to process that, it may not be as black and white as being able to drive or being able to eat a piece of fruit. Suddenly it's, oh, okay, I feel differently, or I have the capacity for empathy for someone that I didn't have before. So there's a number of different ways that it can help.
What was it about trauma therapy in particular that first intrigued you? How did you get started with it? Can you talk a little bit about your training and the work you did with the New York Fire Department?
Sure. So I kind of accidentally fell into it. I went to graduate school for social work, and in social work school and for most of the psychology and counseling disciplines, you have to do internships. In social work, they call it a field placement. And my field placement, my second year in social work school, was at the New York City Fire Department in the counseling service unit. And this was 2004. So it was about 3 years after 9/11. And I think anyone who lived in New York at that time can maybe remember what it was like. But 3 years post 9/11, the New York City Fire Department was devastated by 9/11, not only losing, 343 of their members and their biggest loss of life ever, but then having to work for a year after that in the recovery effort to find colleagues and their family members. And it was just something like we'd never seen before. So having that internship at that time was incredibly powerful. And so I worked there as my internship and then got hired out of there and worked there until 2016. And it wasn't just trauma. There's all different kinds of issues that you'd see in the general population. And it was there that I trained in EMDR. And it was really powerful to have this tool. Talk therapy is wonderful. It does a lot for a lot of people, but there's something about trauma and the way that it gets stuck and in those beliefs and the sensory perception that a lot of times people would go through talking about a trauma and still get stuck on pieces like where they would say, I know it wasn't my fault in my head. I can say that cognitively, like it makes sense that this wasn't my fault, but in my heart, I don't believe it. And I've seen EMDR sort of integrate that where like someone does really walk away believing like that wasn't my fault or whatever their negative cognition, I deserve this, or I could have done more, or, whatever they're stuck on that, again, they could cognitively believe, but, had trouble really believing it in their hearts, and in their nervous systems.
What other signature elements are included in an EMDR session?
So before we start any of the EMDR processing, we do something called resourcing. And resourcing is a way of regulating your nervous system. So the same way that can sort of access these traumatic memories and you can get like a felt sense of them, we can also do that with positive memories. And we can really kind of flesh out the imagination around these memories. So if you think about like our nervous system doesn't know the difference between what's real and imagined. So the example I always use of that is if you go to a horror movie and you feel scared, even though you know you're in the movie theater, you know you're watching fiction, you know this is not real, you know it's fake, but your body is still reacting to it. You're still like getting that pit of the stomach. You're still reacting physically to it. And we can use that to our advantage. And so in resourcing, we try and think of images or people, places, things that elicit this feeling of warmth, safety, feeling whole in our nervous system. And so it can be even just a tiny glimmer of something, like this time that my mom hugged me and it felt really warm and safe. And then you just kind of visualize that and feel it in your body, what it was like to be hugged, what it was like to be embraced, and sort of reinforce that either through like the butterfly hug again or bilateral stimulation, so that you know how to be safe. You know how to feel whole. You just have to remind your nervous system of that. And I think that's something that people can do on their own too, right? Like you can really like savor a feeling and notice what it feels like in your body when you're doing that. And then after we do that, the way that I would start an EMDR session is focusing on the memory. But again, not just like the actual memory, but the body sensations that go with that, the sensory feeling around that, the belief about yourself in that memory, and the emotion that comes up with it. So it's really like those 4 things that we start processing on.
Got it. And then the client just starts speaking from there, wherever it takes them.
Yep. They'll hold the tappers or they'll begin the bilateral stimulation. You'll say, let whatever comes up come up without censoring it. And then really wherever your mind goes is where we kind of process through it.
The best word I can use to describe it is journey. I mean, you start in this place and it just takes loops and turns, and felt like sometimes we would get to a point where I thought we were at the end. Mm-hmm. And then there's just silence, or you would ask a question, or something would push me further, deeper. Mm-hmm. And that's really where I think I uncovered some pretty big surprises in terms of beliefs I was holding on to about myself that cognitively I never thought existed. I didn't think they were present in my mind, but it was really incredible the things that I said and realized I believed about myself as we started to stay in the discomfort and follow it to the end, which is hard to do. And I do think that so often we're quick to pivot or think of something else or distract ourselves from that feeling, which is where I think the tappers are really effective at holding your focus, keeping you present, keeping you breathing and following the path to wherever it leads.
Yeah. And to keep asking, you know, what's still disturbing, right? And so, like you said, sometimes it feels like there's nothing there, but if you really sit with it for a minute, and a lot of times it's in the body, a lot of times it's like, well, no, it doesn't seem disturbing, but my heart's still fluttering, or, you know, there's still a little like sensation in my stomach. So yeah, I think it kind of does force you to go a little bit deeper with that. And it allows like that, the defenses to come away a little bit, you know, it allows that subconscious governing system to take a step back, and which allows us then to access it and really do the work.
What has been the most surprising thing you've learned or seen along your journey to heal others?
I'm always amazed by the resiliency of people come in and they have this story that's so painful and a lot of times pervasive and has been with them for so long. And their ability to really heal through it is incredible. You know, just to even step into this room, I think is intimidating. And I'm just always amazed at the resilience that they show me again and again. You know, these people are coming in and healing themselves, you know, and it doesn't matter how old they are or what they've been through. And I'm just impressed with that.
Yeah, it's a hard thing to decide you want to do that kind of work and go all in the way that EMDR really takes you there.
Yeah.
I've certainly found working with you pretty transformational in a lot of ways. And I'm curious how you've seen EMDR specifically help people reconnect with themselves on a deeper level. And I know we've touched on this throughout our conversation, but with a focus on getting curious about yourself and understanding yourself a little bit better. Anything that you would share?
I think trauma disconnects us from ourselves, can create these faulty beliefs. It can really impact our ability to trust our judgment, our intuition, ourselves. So by healing that, or by integrating the trauma into our lives through EMDR, it creates a bigger connection to oneself. You begin to trust your judgment again, trust your intuition, and understand parts of yourself that maybe just seemed mysterious before.
I think the other thing that I've felt with you in some of our sessions is that it also allows you to go back and give yourself what you didn't get in the moment of the trauma. And
absolutely,
I emphasize that because so much of the emotion for me was packed in to seeing this 9-year-old girl feeling scared, alone, really helpless, abandoned in some ways, or more so just unseen by the world. And to go back and visualize my present day self giving her a hug and giving her what she needs in that moment is so powerful. And I cannot speak to the significance for everyone, because I think the experience is different depending on what you're holding on to. But going back and figuring out how to give yourself something that you didn't get or receive as a young child is the most powerful medicine on the planet.
Absolutely. That's such a great way of describing it, and so, poignant in that being cut off from ourselves. But that EMDR emphasizes this dual awareness, right? You're going back into the past, but you're also here in the room where you're safe and you're adult in your case, and able to take that with you to that childhood self. And I think that's part of, a big part of it is that you are always maintaining that awareness that you're here. And that even though you're feeling and experiencing things from the past, you are safe in the present and able to give yourself that, which is really incredibly empowering to know that you went through that, but you're on the other side of it now, and you can give your younger self that, trauma isn't just what happens to you or how you perceive what happens to you. It's also what you didn't get. Sometimes there is no actual event of trauma, but there's neglect, feeling unseen or, abandoned, and getting things that all children and eventually adults need. But for some reason you didn't get that. And I think that can be a little confusing to people when they say, well, nothing really happened in my childhood. It was totally normal. But there's something that they weren't getting. And so that's a whole other part of trauma that I think we're starting to really recognize in the field. And I think, the second part of that is that there's trauma, and then there's the system that reacts to trauma. If the child isn't believed, if they're, not supported, if they don't feel like they're getting what they need in their environment. So I always say that it's not just what happened, it's then how that system around you reacted to what happened. And what you didn't get and what you needed. And that's a big part of EMDR is really giving yourself what you need.
So powerful. I think so many people think, that's not trauma. It seems like such an insignificant event or thing that happened to me versus this other person who had real trauma. And I think it can be really eye-opening to realize that it is those sometimes micro traumas.
Yeah. And they're just as damaging in a way because we deny them. We think they didn't happen. We do comparative suffering. There's so much worse trauma in the world. This doesn't matter. How can I complain about this? I think there's social trauma too. You have to remember that evolutionarily, we are tribal animals where we travel in packs and we have social systems. And so being excluded is traumatic when you feel like you're not part of something. It may not seem like it, but from an evolutionary standpoint, that's threatening. If you lost your tribe or were left behind, you would die. So being excluded is absolutely a trauma. And I think beginning to recognize these things allows us to then heal them.
100%. I have read or heard that trauma can be passed on from your parents as well. It doesn't necessarily have to have happened to you. I know that gets into a topic that we can save for a future episode because there's probably a lot to unpack there. But is that true? And is that something that you've seen in your practice?
Yeah, I think it's definitely true on a lot of different levels. If you think about, somebody who's been traumatized, and no matter what that is, if, they've grown up in poverty, if they have, been victims of war, I often think about Holocaust survivors, right? And the systematic, torture that they went through. And then you raise a family, you're going to be reacting differently to that family. And so the way that you raise your children is going to be impacted by that trauma. So that is more of like the nurture side of nurture versus nature. But there is mounting evidence that trauma actually changes your DNA as well.
I love the breakdown of nurture versus nature. I was listening to another podcast recently talking about, I think, an experiment done at Boston University years ago with lab rats, where the mothers were exposed to cherry blossoms, I believe, and shocked simultaneously. And it was discovered that their offspring, their children, also had a trauma response to cherry blossoms because of what their mothers had been through. I'll go back and see if I can cite that study in the show notes. But I thought that was a really fascinating way of bringing to life the nature piece of what you're saying about trauma potentially being passed down via DNA.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a perfect example of it literally changing the DNA of those rats. The baby rats were not exposed to the shocks, but still avoided the cherry blossoms.
It's a fascinating space, and I know there's a lot to unpack. What do you think is a common fear or misnomer about EMDR or even therapy in general? And what would you say to the listener who's thinking about giving it a try?
I think the resistance that I mostly get or that I hear of is not wanting to relive everything. And this fear of, okay, this is going to overwhelm me and what's going to happen and why would I possibly want to talk about like the worst things that have happened in my life, which makes sense again from that fight or flight perspective. That's the fight, right? All that emotion, all of that overwhelm, and the avoidance is the flight part. Like I want to avoid this. I don't want to go here. I don't want to talk about this. It's going to be too much. So that's often the biggest resistance, along with the other type of avoidance, which is minimizing it. That's not traumatic. Or as you said in the beginning, that's in the past. I'm over it. I've worked through it. And those two things would probably be the biggest resistance to coming to EMDR therapy, or that it's not going to help. And what is reliving it going to do? It's not bothering me now. And of course we know that the trauma lives in your body and it comes out in other ways. And even if you're not actively thinking about it, it's coming out somewhere.
Absolutely. And I'm the perfect case study of this. I mean, years of digestive issues, of anxiety, of unexplainable irritability, all things that reached a boiling point last summer and became the impetus for why I reached out to you. But one thing I am 1,000% sure of, confident in, can guarantee anyone thinking about this, you cannot, in my opinion, be happy in your present and future if you are carrying significant baggage from your past. You can go to yoga, you can practice gratitude, you can eat healthy, you can get sleep and meditate, you can do all those things. But truly the unlock for me was going back and clearing out this old and inaccurate belief system that I didn't even know I had or was carrying. And working with you and EMDR really opened my eyes to that. And when I tell you that waking up every morning, I feel like I'm wearing a completely new set of glasses, it's absolutely life altering. I am parenting my kids differently. I am wifing differently. I am getting involved and supporting my community in ways I was never able to before. But most importantly, deep down, I'm starting to identify my own self-worth, and it was non-existent before. And through this work, I've been able to really pivot and adjust whatever I was feeling and holding on to deep down that I just, again, consciously did not know was there. So I understand that it can be incredibly intimidating to think about seeking therapy or explore EMDR specifically. And of course, I acknowledge and understand why, but the benefits on the other side of doing the work are priceless.
I love hearing that.
I mean,
it really is so powerful, to bear witness to that as well.
I really mean it. And don't get me wrong, taking care of yourself in the present and future are also important, as we talk about on this show all the time. But truly, doing the work to get curious about your past and ask those questions and learn how to drop into your body and ask yourself, how am I feeling? Is the most important thing you can do, because you never know what you're going to find. And while it's scary to think about going there and peeling back the onion or looking behind those curtains, it really does pave the way for a completely different and brighter future. So that is my plug.
And I think, you mentioned meditation and yoga, and I love both of those things so much. They're incredible, incredible resources and modalities, but sometimes for people with trauma, they're not accessible. Sitting in your body and your mind, like meditation, or really a lot of people are very triggered by yoga and the bringing together of the body. So I think working through trauma and processing it through EMDR can help you to enjoy the benefits of those things.
I love that. And really an important point. I mean, obviously, we're major advocates of yoga and meditation and mindset and all the things on this show. But I love the concept of EMDR to allow you to access these other tools that can help you drop into your body, be more curious about yourself, and give yourself what you need and maybe didn't get.
And again, removing those obstacles that
Yeah.
are in the way of you really enjoying life to the fullest.
Well, I so believe in the power of therapy. So I'm curious, for listeners now contemplating a therapist, what resources would you recommend that are available to everyone?
So for EMDR, I think, the best way to go about that is to go to EMDRIA, which is the EMDR International Association's website. And that's where you can find, a list of certified EMDR therapists by state. I believe it has information on whether or not they take insurance. In terms of therapy in general, my recommended way of finding a therapist is asking people for referrals. There's so many, lists out there, Psychology Today and all these places where you can look up therapists. But I find that personal experience is the best guidance for that. I think, the most important thing is that you feel comfortable and safe with that therapist, and don't be afraid to speak up if you don't and to try someone else. It's different for everybody. Some people really gel and others don't. And, there's not one particular type of therapist for every person. So I really, emphasize that relationship is critically important in doing any kind of therapy.
Thank you so much, Jen, for being here today. I really enjoyed our conversation and can't thank you enough for taking the time and for all of the support you've given me since you and I started working together.
Well, thank you, Chandler, for having me. And of course, it's my pleasure to work with you and to help, spread this message to other people that they can heal themselves.
To those tuning in, if you liked today's discussion, please share it with friends and don't forget to subscribe. You can also visit healingheroespodcast.com to get resources, meet the heroes, and share your ideas for future episodes. Thanks for listening, everyone. And until next time, remember, be curious, be courageous, and be kind to yourself. You've got this.